For more on the war in Ukraine, Thomas Graham joins us now. Thomas is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
He served as special assistant to President George W. Bush and senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff from 2004 to 2007. And Thomas, you wrote that Western leaders need to focus on containing the war in Ukraine within that country. What does that mean exactly, and how can they achieve that?
Well, the war has been confined to Ukraine at this point, but we have to be concerned about it spilling over beyond the borders of Ukraine, particularly into Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, we have a number of NATO allies. If the war were to spill over into Eastern Europe, that would invoke the Article 5 NATO guarantee of collective security, which would bring us and our NATO allies into direct military conflict with Russia. And that always carries the specter of nuclear war. We've already seen the Russians say that the convoys that are bringing Western supplies into Ukraine are legitimate military targets. We saw the Russians strike a military base close to the Polish border just in the past few days. So the conflict is getting closer to NATO countries, and that should be a problem for us.
Thomas, we learned today that around 3 million people have fled Ukraine by now. You also write that Moscow could, quote, weaponize those refugees. How do you see that happening?
Well, what Moscow could do over time in this conflict is try to push those refugees into territories, countries that are less able to deal with the great influx of refugees. Poland has handled this quite well up to this point, but even Poland is being strained. We look at a country like Moldova, a country of 2 million people along the border with Ukraine that has very little capacity to deal with major flows of refugees. The same thing, I think, is true of countries like Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. We're only at 3 million refugees at this point. The numbers could go much higher. If the conflict were to spill beyond Ukraine's borders, we would not only have refugees from Ukraine, we would have refugees from places in Eastern Europe as well flooding westward. So all this would put tremendous stress on the socioeconomic situation in countries in Europe that are already suffering from the pandemic, inflation, and so forth. One final element here is you'll remember that last October, the Belarusian president pushed a number of Middle Eastern refugees towards the Polish and Lithuanian borders that came close to conflict between border guards on both sides. So that's another option as well of weaponizing and complicating the refugee situation as far as Western Europe is concerned.
And Thomas, broadly, what can the United States actually do at this point, though, to prevent a broader conflict, given what we have seen already unfold?
Well, some of the things the United States is doing already. Our diplomacy or our policy towards Russia is always a combination of deterrence and diplomacy. We've done very well on the deterrence side. We've augmented our forces, NATO forces in Eastern Europe, to send a signal to President Putin that we are, in fact, determined to defend NATO territory. As President Biden has said, we will defend every inch of NATO territory. That sends an appropriate signal. We can also help deal with the resettlement of refugees to show that increasing the flow of refugees is not going to damage our ability to defend ourselves and also to help the Ukrainians. But we also need to open up a diplomatic channel. At the end of the day, Russia, Moscow, President Putin wants to talk with us and try to settle broader questions of European security. That, I think, is the element that is lacking so far in the administration's response to the conflict in Ukraine.
Thomas Graham, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.